Chapter 12, Land Resource Management. There are two general categories of managed land in the U.S., private and public. Public lands are often used for resource extraction, but now there is increased pressure for preservation. Parts of Chapter 12 we are covering are 12.1, Recreation versus Preservation, 12.2, National Environmental Policy Act and Impact Statements, and 12.5, Urban Impacts. The largest landowner in the U.S. is the federal government. 7 federal agencies manage federally owned land in the U.S., which is about 28% of land in America, or about 636 million acres. This includes 84 million acres of parks, some 200 million acres of national forests, and 150 million acres of wildlife refuge. Most of these lands are in the western half of the U.S., or Alaska. Since 1972, ocean areas have been added, including the use Since 1972, ocean areas have been added using the National Marine Sanctuary Program. These areas include Pacific Remote Islands National Marine Monument, which President Obama has just increased from almost 87,000 square miles to more than 490 square miles, or 313 million acres. Creation of ocean sanctuaries are primarily driven by overfishing and pollution of waterways. Much debate over management of public lands stems from the conflicting purposes of conservation and preservation. Preservationists argue that public natural resources should be preserved as much as possible as pristine wilderness. Conservationists argue that public resources should be open to mining, logging, grazing, and other human uses. Questions asked about federal land use include: are the users of public resources paying their fair share? What is the purpose of national parks? Accessibility to all or preservation? What is the purpose of national forests? Utilization or preservation? Public land use rules include federally owned property are regulated partially by the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. NEPA requires that all activities on federal public lands be reviewed for their environmental impacts before those activities can continue. A key part of NEPA is the Environmental Impact Statement, or EIS. An environmental impact statement is a detailed analysis that serves to ensure that the policies and goals defined in NEPA are infused into the ongoing programs and actions of the federal agency. EISs are generally prepared for projects that the proposing agency views as having significant prospective environmental impacts. The EIS should provide a discussion of significant environmental impacts and reasonable alternatives, including a no-action alternative, which would avoid or minimize adverse impacts or enhance the quality of the human environment. Agencies should allow at least a 45-day comment period for draft EISs and a 30-day comment period for the final EIS. Prior to requiring an environmental impact statement, agencies can ask for what's called an environmental assessment, which determines if a full impact statement is required. An environmental assessment briefly provides sufficient evidence and analysis for determining whether to prepare a full EIS. It aids in an agency's compliance with NEPA when no full EIS is necessary. In other words, it helps to identify better alternatives and mitigation measures. And finally, it facilitates preparation of an EIS when one is necessary. The EIS has become a basic tool to protect the environment on federal lands. The EIS requires that anyone proposing action on public lands documents the need for the project, reasonable alternatives to it, an overview of the natural environment affected, and the environmental consequences of the project. Managing lands to reduce urban impact. Urban or suburban sprawl is spreading of a population into the countryside around a city. Urban sprawl or suburban sprawl describes the expansion of human populations away from urban areas into previous remote and rural areas, often resulting in communities that are heavily reliant upon automobile usage and also have increased pollution per person. As of 2005, about half of all people globally lived in cities. Lateral expansion from these cities increases at a much faster rate than the population growth of the city in recent memory. Causes of sprawl are controversial, where supporters claim that consumers prefer lower density neighborhoods. Others have argued that sprawl is more a result of legal structures and court decisions that have encouraged sprawl development. The rate of land development in the U.S. over the past 40 years show an increase in both private and public land use. After 1985, the acreage being developed is increasing much faster than acreage being preserved as public parks or even as private land. This coincides with the changing political climate over the last 30 years. Causes of sprawl can be simply stated as the rise of automobile and road construction, desire for affordable houses and land, desire for escape from city crime, and perhaps marketing. There are some consequences to all this type of sprawl development. Economic consequences include that sprawl is a very expensive way for people to live. In addition, when residents relocate outside the city's core, they take their tax dollars with them. Often it's the city's poorest residents that are left behind. This creates economic disparity and stratification based upon location. It also creates funding problems for the city, which directly affects the money available for education, crime prevention, and maintenance and upkeep in urban areas. Environmental consequences include the widespread infrastructure required for habitation and increased impacts and increases on impact. The low-density residential patterns typically appearing as one of the effects of urban sprawl increase the demand for road building and the need to spend money on new schools, public services, utilities, waste disposal, water, and sewer infrastructure. Police, fire, and emergency medical services must be provided immediately, but the demand for recreational programs and centers won't be far behind. Even if developers are billed for the obvious additions to roads and storm sewers, the effects of urban sprawl on public services are significant. There's also an increased use of resources. For example, more building materials used per person, more infrastructure for water, sewer, energy, etc. Spreading out development also creates water distribution problems that can lead to water overconsumption. A typical low-density or suburban community uses more water than a high-density community. Landscaping is the primary culprit for this excessive use of water, and according to the EPA, 30% of the water used daily in the United States is devoted to outdoor use. Other costs center around human health. Increased air and water pollution. Longer and more frequent commutes are a major concern associated with urban sprawl. The average American spends the equivalent of 8 55-hour work weeks behind the steering wheel of a car annually, according to Sierra Club, and more driving leads to more air pollution. You can have runoff from development, and that can also impact local watersheds. We have areas in Maine that are like that, such as China Lake, where the development around the lake is disturbing the fragile ecosystem and causing eutrophication. There's also decreased levels of physical activity for people living in these communities. People living in suburban areas are much more likely to be obese than people living in urban areas, according to the Ontario College of Family Physicians and the American Planning Association. Both of these studies show that people living in suburban areas tend to rely on their vehicles more often, even for short trips, instead of walking or cycling. This lower level of activity increases the risk of obesity, which can lead to other health problems such as heart disease, high blood pressure, and diabetes. And finally, there's loss of community. Isolation of the young, the poor, and the elderly, who cannot drive or lack access to cars. There are some things you can do to curb sprawl. There are programs that are successfully doing things like curbing brownstone development or brownfield development, where old industries are repurposed into new developments. You can apply natural siting criteria, which takes into account the ecological impact of site selection for new development. You can apply wildscaping, which is the retention of native vegetation and physical features of the landscape that minimize ecological and environmental impact. And you can do mitigation. That's replacing a removed or destroyed environment with a new one in a different location. For example, if a contractor wants to move a wetland, by federal law, he's expected to replace that exact amount of wetland in another area. This is often not successful due to placement of these new areas or cost issues. There are some legal incentives as well. You can have greenbelt zoning prohibiting removal of natural vegetation. You can increase the gas tax that would discourage dispersed housing, like they do in most of the world, like Europe and many parts of the world. You can have something called developer pays, which discourages large subdivisions. Developer pays planning does not give tax breaks or other financial incentives to developers. Developers must pay the true costs of developing the entire development, including environmental mitigation. And you can have private preservation groups that can limit sprawl through incentives like conservation easements. A conservation easement can take many legal forms, but basically it is a voluntary agreement that allows a landowner to limit the type or amount of development on their property while retaining private ownership of the land. The easement is tied to the deed, so it is maintained to both the present and future owners of that land. In Maine, easements are a growing way for people to preserve land and still live on it. Over 97% of conservation easements in Maine are on private land. The other 2.5% are lands owned by nonprofits or government. The total amount of land under conservation easement in Maine is 2,371,000 acres. Most of that land has been put into easement in just the last 15 years. Let's review what we talked about in Chapter 12. We should know what the difference between preservation and conservation is. What are the arguments they're trying to make? What is the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA? And what are the environmental assessment versus environmental impact statements? What is urban sprawl or suburban sprawl? How do we define it? What causes it? Why do we do it? What are some of the consequences of sprawl? And what can we do to prevent or combat it?